of that is to say nothing of Taiwan, sometimes referred to by Chinese, quoting or citing Americans as the so-called unsinkable aircraft carrier. And all of a sudden you've got a rather volatile mix. So there's a lot going on. And for those who are studying the East Asia region, this is a fascinating and challenging time. And I think that there is a higher level of tension in the region today than I've seen in any number of recent years. Let me make one other point before briefly just addressing your last question. And that is, I think if you were to ask most people who study foreign policy, at least from an American perspective, but I think people anywhere, what are the likeliest flashpoints in the world in terms of potential conflagration in a military sense? Literally, where might the next war on Earth start? High on the list of the top 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9 places would be several places in Asia. There are a lot of people that would put, obviously, North Korea at the top of the list as a place that is very potentially a powder keg in terms of the real potential for conflict. And by the way, North Korea is a nuclear weapons state. The stakes are very high there. There are a good number of people that would put Taiwan toward the top of the list. Not saying that there will be conflict, but that the potential for conflict is there because of various dynamics. We could drill down into that. South China Sea, even East China Sea, a lot of tension. Depending on which point of view you take, you may have one view or the other about these areas. But the fact is, in the East Asian area, within a few hundred miles of each other, are literally some of the hottest potential flashpoints in the world. And so it is an area of the world that is fraught with tension, and I think that's why this administration has made it a focal point. To answer your question about gloomy versus happy, I guess I would say I'm trying to be realistic, and I think the real story of what's happening in U.S. China relations and the real story of what's happening in the region isn't gloomy, but it is also not all light and sweetness. This is going to be a challenging time. What I think is the happy story is that we've got an extraordinary new generation of folks, including from Michigan State University, coming into the mix to help make a difference on these thorny issues. And I mean that very genuinely, because oftentimes problems that folks currently in office or working on these issues can't deal with have to be dealt with by the smarter folks who come along in the next generation. So that, I think, is the happy note. And I'm not alarmist about it, but I think we've got our work cut out for us. Yes, sir, final question.
Thank you. In respect to politics, you have mentioned there's a shift from human rights to economic rights.
Yes.
So is it because China has made progresses in human rights, or congressmen has become much more realistic and they think economic interest is much more important than human rights?
It's a great question. And let me just say that in my judgment, my interpretation of this shift is not that U.S. leaders think that the human rights picture in China is better, because they don't. But whether they're right or wrong, one can debate that. But they definitely don't think that the human rights picture in China is better. But what they do think is, in a sense, these are my words, obviously not theirs, but my analysis is that many leaders in this country, in a sense, feel that we almost can't afford the luxury right now of spending our time and capital dealing with China on the very important issue of human rights, because we're in some ways falling behind on issues that are affecting the daily lives of average American workers, farmers, and businessmen and ranchers in this country. So, in a sense, it goes back to that old 1992 statement. It's the economy, stupid. And that is very true now for how U.S. leaders look at China. They look at China through the prism of what's happening in this country economically. And let me go back and make a point about perceptions. When you're growing at 4.6% a year, let me restate that. When you have 4.6% unemployment in this country, which is the lowest level of unemployment in the modern history of America, and which we had in the 1990s. When you're looking at China from a position of 4.6% unemployment, you feel emboldened and empowered to address all kinds of other issues because things are good here. China looks different from a perspective of 4.6% unemployment than it looks from a perspective of 10.1% unemployment or 7.8. So as things deteriorated here economically, I think leaders in this country of both parties started to say, whatever is going on human rights-wise in China, our most significant interest at this time, in light of our current economic performance, is the economic and trade basket of issues, and that's where we have to focus our efforts. So it's a very good question, and I feel very confident that the analysis that I'm sharing is an accurate assessment of what U.S. elites think. Whether one agrees or disagrees with what they think is a different story, but I think this is a fair characterization. And the reality is, and let me just say, bear in mind what has happened from a human rights standpoint just in the last few years. And I'm citing this to simply substantiate the point that I'm making, that U.S. elites don't perceive that China's human rights picture has gotten better. At the end of 2010, a Nobel Peace Prize winner in China was put in prison. Now, one doesn't have to judge that for purposes of this discussion to say that it shouldn't surprise anyone that when a country puts a Nobel Peace Prize winner in prison, that that's going to have an enormous impact on popular perception in this country about the human rights picture in China. So these are the kinds of things that have happened, and that's why I believe that it's for the latter reason, not the former reason, that the increased emphasis on economics and trade have occurred. But it's a great question. I appreciate your asking it. Thank you all so much. Go Spartans. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank Mr. Firestein for his very interesting talk, and he will be joining us, and I hope you will too, in the reception across the hall. And I hope that there'll be time for additional conversation over some snacks and eats that we have.